Today, we take it for granted. Liberty. Freedom. It could have been quite different. And it almost was. Out of the carrion of World War I, a political infection spread throughout the world like a cancer. Banners. Trumpets. Scalding speeches. Ecstasies of national greatness. The cruel barbarism of the past is retooled by state-of-the-art technology. Manned by the jackbooted thugs that tyranny creates. Spreading from the beer cellars of Munich, the coffee bars of Rome, and the Shinto shrines of Tokyo is a new heathenism with a pantheon of false gods. Adolf Hitler, a Moloch with unlimited power of life and death over his subjects. Benito Mussolini, who uses poison gas and modern aircraft to crush the barefoot, spear-carrying defenders of Ethiopia. Hirohito, a divine emperor of Japan, descendant of the sun goddess. To die for him is life's greatest honor. With increasing boldness, Hitler defies the strictures Germany agreed to in the Versailles Treaty after World War I. He reoccupies the coal-rich Rhineland. He marches into neighboring Austria without firing a shot. No one stops him. As a nation, Austria ceases to exist. He demands that the Sudetenland, a German-speaking province of Czechoslovakia, be turned over to Nazi Germany. The leaders of France and England, who should have come to the Czechs' aid, yield meekly to Hitler's demands. Then he invades Poland, beginning his blitzkrieg, lightning war, with supermodern aircraft and crack tank troops. Panzers against the gallant Poles defending their country with muskets and sabers. Poland falls. At last, France and Britain declare war on Germany, but do nothing to implement their declaration. Now he knifes his way into Scandinavia. Denmark doesn't resist. Norway is under his boot in 4 days. Holland is next. It surrenders. Belgium quits. Incredulously, France collapses. Hitler is unstoppable. Then, a reckless invasion of Russia. And the Germans find themselves fighting on a 2,000-mile front. From the Arctic to the Ukraine. Despite President Franklin D. Roosevelt's efforts to intervene, the United States is firmly isolationist, actually an impotent bystander. When warned that the fighting in Europe and Asia might spread to the New World, most Americans argue confidently, if not smugly, that America is safe. It lies guarded by two of the world's biggest bodies of water. American public opinion can't see beyond the oceans. The armed forces of Japan had swept into Manchuria as a launching site for a sudden invasion of China, which it accomplishes without warning and without a declaration of war. Washington reacts by halting its sale of gasoline and scrap metal to Japan, which it needs desperately to carry on its conquests. The Japanese are furious. When France falls to the Nazis, Japan invades French Indochina, today's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In the Nazi and Japanese victories, Franklin Roosevelt grasps the dangers to America. He realizes that it is vital for the British to hold out against Hitler until the U.S. is ready to face up to him. Thus, he manages to squeak by Congress and send aid under the guise of bundles for Britain and Lend-Lease. Isolationists damn him as a warmonger. But the two broad protective oceans have shrunk. Wolf packs of German submarines, U-boats, sink every merchant vessel flying the stars and stripes they can hunt down. Daily, U-boats are blowing up American merchant ships off the coasts of Long Island, of Cape May, New Jersey. Then, December 7th of 1941, out of clouds of secrecy, Japanese Zeros attack with deadly accuracy the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. (2,403 Americans are killed. When the Japanese bombers are finished, the United States no longer has a Pacific fleet. Americans are in a state of shock. In a remarkably short time, Japan occupies a tenth of the globe. Defeat after defeat. Today, it is difficult to contemplate the United States and its allies losing World War II. Had our enemies been victorious, had the Pacific remained a big Japanese lake, had Nazi Germany held on as master of continental Europe, conquered Britain, and turned a beaten Russia into a slave state, they would have outmanned us, outproduced us in the weapons of war, and outlasted us on the field of battle. Then, they had only to simultaneously dispatch their hordes of fighting men and fleets of bombers and armadas of warships. Germany from the Atlantic, Japan from the Pacific, and crush us like a crab crushing a shell with its claw. But America fought a seasoned enemy on both sides of the world, fought an enemy of skilled veterans, our citizen soldiers enduring not only enemy fire, but desert heat, and Arctic cold, and jungle rot, up climbing at a crawling pace at first, from defeat to victory. If, in today's world, freedom can flourish and democracy thrive, it is so because of the men and women who fought this war against terrible odds and won it. In some 15 crucial battles which spelled the outcome of the war. How did they do it?
The vast Atlantic, 1939. World War II has just begun, and Winston Churchill faces a grave threat. In order for the island of England to survive, 1 million tons of supplies must be imported by ship every month. England's lifeline to the rest of the world is seriously threatened by Germany's menacing and modern U-boat fleet. If the U-boats can send enough British oil and food to the bottom of the ocean, England will surely fall victim to the Third Reich. The longest battle of the Second World War was one of the most important, the Battle of the Atlantic. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The well-armed warships of the Royal Navy were the world's most formidable force. But England had to rely on its merchant marine to import the 55 million tons of goods it needed annually. It was up to these 160,000 sailors to fulfill the demand. Meanwhile, in Germany, a massive shipbuilding program was underway. Nevertheless, Hitler was tentative about tangling with the famed British Navy. He said, "On land, I am a hero, but on water, I am a coward." The British soon gave him good reason to feel that way. In December, Germany's new battleship, the Graf Spee, pride of their navy, was hunting Allied ships in the South Atlantic when she was attacked by 4 smaller British ships in the waters off Uruguay. The Graf Spee fled the battle and took refuge in a neutral harbor. Rather than face the Brits again, Captain Hans Langsdorff scuttled his ship. To avoid charges of cowardice, Langsdorff shot himself. But if the Graf Spee had failed above water, German Admiral Karl Dönitz had a plan to succeed underwater. The submarine veteran of World War I came up with the Z plan. Construct 300 U-boats, said Dönitz, and concentrate 100 of them around Britain to sink its merchant ships. The plan received a less than enthusiastic response from Hitler, who refused to accelerate U-boat construction. So Dönitz did his best to inspire his crews to use the 57 subs he did have to maximum effect.
Wir teilen uns den Druckkörper ein in die Zentrale und in den Maschinenraum.
Despite being short-handed, the German combination of mines and U-boats proved lethal to Britain. In the first 9 months of war, 141 British ships carrying 750,000 tons of supplies were sunk by these weapons. Winston Churchill would say, "The only thing that frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." In the spring of 1940, with losses mounting, Churchill nevertheless put on a brave face for the British public.
We are in a very different position from that we were in 10 weeks ago. We are far stronger than we were 10 weeks ago. We are far better prepared to endure the worst malice of Hitler and his Huns.
June 1940, Hitler and his Huns have taken Paris. France is under German control. To make matters worse, Italy has joined forces with Germany. The Nazis, now masters of Europe, build submarine pens at the French ports of Lorient, Brest, and Cherbourg, just 31 miles from the English coast. The British situation seems desperate. The Germans and their deadly U-boats are positioned to cut off Britain from the rest of the world. In response, the British use every available ship to bring in supplies, including the Queen Elizabeth, the world's most famous luxury liner. To reduce the odds of being spotted by Germans, the British begin sailing in convoys. The idea is that in the huge Atlantic, it's easier to hide one large needle in a haystack than 50 smaller ones. German U-boats responded by hunting in wolf packs at night. And without the help of sonar, which the Allies had yet to perfect, the convoys were sitting ducks. In the first 8 months of 1941, 328 English ships were sunk. If this rate continued, it would be only a matter of months before Britain fell to the Nazis. Winston Churchill now looked to America for help, not for troops, but for ships and supplies.
Give us the tools, and we will finish the job.
In the U.S., there was opposition to any involvement in what was viewed as a European war, but President Roosevelt asked Congress to give Churchill. Congress voted yes, and America's Lend-Lease Act gave Britain a lease on life. America rapidly produced supplies to shore up England against the Germans. But FDR knew that Britain needed more than America's supplies. It needed America. In the summer of '41, President Roosevelt, rarely seen standing without help, stood for his first meeting with Churchill. The secret rendezvous took place in the Atlantic waters they were trying to keep free. Roosevelt and Churchill ironed out the Atlantic Charter. Now Britain and America would protect the Atlantic together. Hitler realized Roosevelt had upped the ante in the Battle of the Atlantic. He decided to support Admiral Dönnitz's call for more men and increased U-boat production. By January 1942, the Germans had produced 249 subs. They were closing in on Dönnitz's goal of 300. At this time, half the U.S. Navy was in the Pacific fighting the Japanese. The other half was now committed to the Atlantic to escort merchant ships. Germany's U-boats would have even more targets in their sights. But America built ships faster than the Germans could sink them. Industrialist Henry Kaiser launched 1,500 Liberty ships in record time. By October 1942, American naval yards were turning out 3 ships a day. Following the British example, the U.S. set up a convoy system as the Battle of the Atlantic came to America's shores. In 1942, most East Coast cities had yet to black out their lights at night. Silhouetted against bright shore lights, Allied ships off the coast of major U.S. cities were easy targets for nearby German U-boats. Americans may have felt safe far from Europe's battlefield, but just off the coast of Boston, New York, Washington, and Miami, German U-boats sank 92 ships. Some Florida towns actually refused to turn off their lights for fear of damaging their tourist trade. Instead, it damaged their shipping trade. Anything that floated became a target. In one 2-week period, the Nazis sank 25 ships off Florida's coast. The first 6 months after America entered the war went down in German legend as the happy time and the American hunting season. In Germany, U-boat sailors known as Kriegsmariners were welcomed home as heroes for challenging America in her own backyard. It seemed that these men would win the Battle of the Atlantic. Happy time for the Germans indeed. But the hunter was about to become the hunted. Enigma was Germany's coding device that scrambled and transmitted the Nazis' military messages. Allied engineers had been working furiously to unscramble the Nazi code. In 1942, they cracked it. They now knew where the German wolf packs were being sent to hunt. They simply diverted their ships from those waters. Another new discovery, sonar, enabled the Allies to pinpoint the depth of U-boats. Previously untraceable, the subs now were easier to find and destroy. Technology proved to be the pivot point in the Battle of the Atlantic. With the advent of sonar, the life of every Kriegsmariner was in danger. U-boats, once invincible, were now easy targets for Allied planes. In 1943, the Allies gained the upper hand in the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats had little hope of survival when attacked by exploding depth charges called hedgehogs and squids. Nearly 1.5 subs were being sunk for every Allied ship lost. The terrified U-boat crews knew Germany's happy time was over. The Kriegsmarine had become the most perilous branch of the German armed forces. May of 1943 was most horrible for Karl Dönitz and his beloved U-boat service. A record 41 of his subs were sunk that month. Dönitz's son was killed in one of those sinkings. The admiral knew his U-boats could not survive the constant Allied pounding from sky and sea. He withdrew most of his fleet in an attempt to salvage what was left. The Allies had the U-boats on the run. Some German captains chose to surrender their subs as exhausted and terrified crews could take no more of the endless pounding. The Battle of the Atlantic was a crucial turning point in World War II and in history. Had Hitler given Dönitz the number of U-boats he asked for early in the war, Britain might have fallen to the Nazis. In the 1930s, Hermann Göring, chief of Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe, created the most fearsome air force the world had ever seen. Göring's bombers and fighters overwhelmed Poland, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, and France. In August of 1940, Germany's Luftwaffe turned its full might against Great Britain. In what Winston Churchill would call his nation's finest hour, Britain's Royal Air Force rose to challenge the Nazi threat. The epic confrontation became known as the Battle of Britain. By June of 1940, the German army had completed its conquest of Western Europe. Adolf Hitler, supremely confident, now turned his attention across the English Channel. A German invasion force began taking shape, with supplies pouring in from across Nazi Europe. But there was more than the English Channel standing in their way. Hugh Dowding, Britain's Royal Air Force chief, had the RAF in prime fighting condition. They would take to the air and thwart any German invasion force heading across the Channel. Göring needed control of the skies before the Germans could land on English soil. The flamboyant Luftwaffe leader, known for having an ego as enormous as his appetite, vowed to bring the RAF to its knees. After all, he had twice as many planes as the British. Among them was the lightning-quick Messerschmitt 109 fighter, considered the most deadly aircraft in the world. Göring's bombers, including the Dornier 17, were equally feared, having demolished most of Europe's other air forces before they got off the ground. Göring's plan was to strike at the heart of Britain's air defense, wipe out air command centers and airstrips, destroy RAF planes while they were still on the ground. With their runways, repair facilities, and headquarters crippled, the RAF would be useless. Then the land invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, would begin. 250,000 German soldiers would cross the 31-mile channel and invade southern England. British soldiers braced for the invasion, while Prime Minister Winston Churchill offered words of defiance in an historic radio address.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
To defend their skies, the British stepped up production on planes, such as the Hawker Hurricane, slower than the German Messerschmitt, but able to reach higher altitudes. Chief among British fighters was the Spitfire. With a Rolls-Royce engine, the Spitfire was every bit as fast and maneuverable as the Messerschmitt, as the Germans would soon learn. A key advantage for the British was radar. Developed throughout the 1930s, British radar could locate the Luftwaffe before they reached their targets. Time and again, the RAF would surprise the cocky German pilots who had yet to face a major challenge in the skies. On August 13, 1940, proclaimed Eagle Day by the Nazi High Command, the Battle of Britain was officially launched. Nazi bombers and fighters flew 1,500 missions across the Channel that day, attacking British airstrips, factories, and ports. But the British too enjoyed success. Thanks to their radar, the RAF anticipated the Luftwaffe's every move. The Germans suffered heavy losses on their self-proclaimed Eagle Day. "34 German planes were shot down, while the Brits lost but 13. In the first confrontation in the Battle of Britain, the RAF emerged victorious. But it was just the beginning. The British also benefited from a home field advantage. They could easily rescue their downed pilots, who would soon fight again. Downed German pilots, on the other hand, remained grounded in POW camps, never again to return to battle. Throughout August, the Germans maintained their attack, launching strike after strike from hidden staging points in France. British pilots stayed on duty around the clock while waiting for the next raid. Often pilots returning from one sortie barely had time to catch their breath before returning to the skies. These RAF pilots keenly felt the pressure. The fate of England rested on their shoulders. Through the summer of 1940, British pilots downed German planes at a ratio of almost 2-to-1. But British airplane production was falling behind the Germans, and the RAF's smaller force of pilots were overworked and weary. In Germany, Göring was impatient for the battle to end. He inspired his pilots by telling them that the RAF was on its last legs and only their final defeat was holding up the invasion. On August 24th, an accidental bombing would prove the pivot point in the Battle of Britain. A small group of German bombers heading for an English military target flew off course. They mistakenly dropped their bombs on the heart of London. Ordinary people were struck down heading home from work, a pub, or a movie house. Until now, Londoners had been spared, but within this carnage, Winston Churchill saw an opportunity. If he could goad the Nazis into attacking London, RAF bases across England would have time to rebuild, RAF pilots time to rest and regroup. The next day, to provoke the Germans, Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid. The anti-Semitic Göring had been quoted as saying, "If bombs fall on Berlin, my name is Meyer." But during the night, RAF bombers struck at the German capital. The bombing humiliated Göring and Hitler and inflamed them into acting rashly. A furious Hitler fell into Churchill's trap. In a public address, he vowed that for every bomb to fall on Berlin, 10 times as many would be dropped on London. Meeting in Berlin, Hitler and Göring changed their strategy of bombing military targets to one of terror bombing London. On September 7, 1940, Londoners looked up to find swarms of German bombers on the horizon. For the first time, instead of splitting up and attacking military targets, the Luftwaffe converged en masse over London. The German bombs turned London into an inferno. Hundreds of people were killed and thousands were left homeless. London's firefighters fought valiantly but were ill prepared for the German firebombings. Nothing was sacred as the Luftwaffe returned again and again in what was called the London Blitz. But while the bombs fell, the RAF seized the opportunity to repair airstrips and airplanes and refresh weary pilots. The bombings had another important consequence. The scenes of London in flames touched a chord in America's heart and turned American public opinion against isolationism. At night, many Londoners slept in the relative safety of their subway system, while bombs rained down from overhead. In the morning, however, it was business as usual. Most Londoners stayed on their jobs throughout the Blitz and contributed everything they could to the war effort. While London withstood the Luftwaffe's fury, the Royal Air Force made a remarkable recovery. Well-rested Spitfire crews now engaged Messerschmitts in dogfights over London's rooftops in full view of the thousands below. Londoners even kept score as the RAF gained the upper hand. On September 15, 1940, a day known to the British as the Battle of Britain Day, the RAF won another momentous victory in the sky, crushing Germany's invasion plans. Spitfires and Hurricane fighters were directed by radar towards droves of German planes as they crossed the channel. Radar had again given the RAF the edge. This time, 56 German planes were shot down and dozens more damaged. It was the battle that broke the Luftwaffe's back. At his private office in Berlin, Adolf Hitler learned of the defeat. Hitler had to launch his invasion of Britain soon before winter weather made the Channel uncrossable. But fearing now it would be months before the RAF could be conquered, the invasion was canceled. History had taken a dramatic turn. The mighty Nazi war machine had met its first defeat. It was the first crucial turning point of World War II. In the Battle of Britain, the bold and brave of the Royal Air Force had saved their nation and perhaps the world.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Pearl Harbor was an event that transformed America. It charted this nation's course and exposed the armed forces of the United States at their most vulnerable. That is why we remember and still probe for reasons. When Admiral Kimmel, who commanded the Pacific Fleet at the time of the attack, was asked, "Why were you so unprepared?" The Admiral replied bluntly,
"Because I didn't think the Japs could pull it off."
The Japanese were drugged by their own brand of arrogant self-confidence. They believed themselves to be a chosen people. Their Emperor Hirohito was the 124th descendant of an unbroken line of rulers claiming to have sprung from the sun goddess, Amaterasu. He was regarded with such awe that he was never mentioned by his given name. Rather, he was referred to as Tenno, meaning the Son of Heaven. It was an honor to die for him in battle. But ironically, Hirohito chose to call his reign Showa, meaning enlightened peace. A newcomer among the world powers and the only Asian member, Japan sought what it believed to be its divinely appointed place in the sun. Britain, France, and the Netherlands occupied or controlled most of Asia, India, the East Indies, Indochina, indeed China itself, and helped themselves to an abundance of food, fibers, minerals, and petroleum. It was Japan's destiny to drive these European powers out of the Far East. Asians should rule Asians. The first foray in the early 30s was a takeover of Manchuria. Later, Japan launched an all-out attack on China. American sentiments favored the Chinese. An incident near Nanking provided an early warning that should have put the United States on permanent alert. As the city fell to the Japanese, the USS Panay, a Navy gunboat on the Yangtze River, was packed with Western diplomats, business people, and refugees who were being evacuated. It was 1:30 in the afternoon. Though flying the U.S. flag, 2 Japanese warplanes dive-bombed the Panay and sank it. Then survivors being rowed to shore in a lifeboat were strafed by machine guns. 3 Americans were killed, 2 sailors and a civilian. 11 sailors were seriously wounded. The astute U.S. ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph C. Grew, expected the United States to declare war. There was proof that the attack on the Panay was no accident. But Washington, awash in Tokyo's carefully worded excuses and apologies, so sorry, did nothing. Japan had tested the waters. America was no tiger, not at all. Responding to public sentiment for China, the U.S. placed Japan under a moral embargo. To save face, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations. Then the U.S. renounced its trade agreement of commerce and navigation with Japan, and the Japanese lost face. By the end of 1940, the U.S. had not only extended its embargo, cutting off petroleum, scrap iron, steel, and other vital war materials, but had moved a mammoth flotilla of its naval fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. Now Japan's war effort and its very existence as a first world nation are at stake. The fire-eating samurai of old who lived by the code of the warrior had given rise to the Gumbatsu, a military caste. It was this warrior caste that took over the Japanese government under General Hideki Tojo, nicknamed the Razor. Japan feels compelled to seize for itself the rich resources of Southeast Asia. But now the U.S. Navy stands in its way. The Japanese give a name to this festering situation: the cancer of the Pacific. They feel that they must kill this cancer before it kills them. America focused on the cruelties of the Japanese in China, not on their military capabilities. They were simply bullies, coolies with guns, beating up on the little guy. It was because of Nazi militarism in Europe, not Japan's in Asia, that Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act in 1940. It was the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, and there were howls of protest. An indignant clergyman thundered from his pulpit that the draft would reduce American youth to syphilis and slavery. A senator called it a plot to deliver our boys to the British devils. Then General George C. Marshall, the quiet, rangy lifetime soldier who was Army Chief of Staff, publicly equated the United States Army with the standing army of Sweden, and it came out that Henry Ford had more men in his auto plants than the U.S. had under arms. "I did not raise my boy to be a soldier," went the tearful song. Yet mothers' sons from farms and factories, suburbs and slums reported for compulsory military training. In 1940, Japan was secondary. Most Americans, including the president, were focused on Europe, savaged by Hitler's blitzkrieg. Country after country had fallen. The Nazis held Europe in an iron fist. The news of horrors began seeping out. Many Americans saw Nazism as a threat to the U.S.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London.
Nightly raids, night after night, German bombs fell in torrents on the cities of Great Britain. Last holdout against Hitler. How much longer could the British resist? The President and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, a Tennessee circuit judge turned statesman, realized that the Atlantic was no longer a protective moat between America and what was now Hitler's Europe. If Britain fell, the way would be open for Hitler to conquer die ganze Welt, the whole world, which he had declared was his ultimate goal. Presumably, this included the United States.
Never before, since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, has our American civilization been in such danger as now.
Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented third term in 1940. Later, it was discovered that through the German embassy in Washington, the Nazi government spent a lot of money to see Roosevelt defeated. It failed.
And defend the Constitution of the United States.
The president clarified his platform promise to keep America out of the war
except in case of attack.
Except in case of attack. This was the qualifier that could turn his pacifistic promise into a war cry. Until March of 1941, the president had paid lip service to neutrality. By then, Great Britain, holding on by its fingernails, had run out of money to pay for the food and arms that kept it going. The president's response was to ram the Lend-Lease bill through Congress. For Britain, all aid short of war. By enabling the British to fight off Hitler, the U.S. will be keeping the Nazi threat from its shores. To many of his fellow citizens, Roosevelt was a warmonger. He had given them some justification, but we now know that as early as 1938, the German Luftwaffe called for planes capable of bombing New York. And that early in 1941, Hitler and Tojo made plans for a two-ocean attack on the United States. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was only 5'3", but he was a giant, a military genius, the Orient's Lord Nelson. It was he who masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was a complex man of many facets, many contradictions. Japan was his homeland. His devotion to his emperor was unwavering. He sincerely believed that it was Japan's destiny to rule Asia. With his great zest for living, he had come to the United States, studied at Harvard, learned English fluently, traveled extensively, served his country as a naval attaché in Washington. He grew fond of the U.S. and its people. He had long distrusted Hitler, and Tokyo's joining the Berlin-Rome axis distressed him. But Hitler was winning a following among his countrymen. Enthusiasm for the Axis ran high. The nation had set its course, and no matter what his misgivings, Yamamoto was a patriot. With the fall of France to Hitler, Japan occupied Indochina. Now Japan was ready to swoop into the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. But first, to protect its eastern flank, Japan must deal the U.S. Pacific Fleet a knockout blow. So Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, painstakingly planned an attack on Pearl Harbor. It was brilliantly conceived and sealed in secrecy. An attack on a nation he respected and admired. In the spring of 1940, the Pacific Fleet of the United States Navy had arrived. The ships were in Hawaiian waters for maneuvers. Once the exercises were over, the fleet's commander, Admiral James O. Richardson, expected to bring his armada back home to waters in California. But the Navy Department, as directed by President Roosevelt, ordered the fleet to remain at Pearl Harbor as a deterrent to Japanese aggression in the Pacific. Admiral Richardson felt he had good reasons for returning the fleet to the West Coast. Basing the ships in Hawaii created logistical problems, and the new location was too vulnerable to attack. Richardson presented these reasons to the president face to face. Despite his arguments, Mr. Roosevelt was certain that the fleet's deployment to Hawaii had a restraining influence on the Japanese. Admiral Richardson contradicted Mr. Roosevelt. Roosevelt fired him. His replacement took over on a sunny Saturday morning on the first day of February 1941. A vigorous taskmaster in his 50s named Husband Edward Kimmel. He was Kim to his friends, though while a midshipman, he was stuck with the nickname Hubby. Out of his graduating class from Annapolis, he ranked 13th out of 62. Kimmel was Navy to his bone marrow. He was a stickler for order, efficiency, even dress code. When crossed, he was capable of frightening fits of temper. Now he was the overseer of the greatest mass of warships in the world, the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. It was an aloha welcome, To his family, this trip was certainly a once-in-a-lifetime event. But Walter Short himself had told General Marshall that, for family reasons, he'd prefer an assignment on the mainland. Marshall told him that his assignment was an important one. You go to Hawaii. General Walter C. Short had been appointed commanding officer of the U.S. Army's Hawaiian Department. A native of Fillmore, Illinois, Short became an infantry officer and had served honorably in World War I. General Herron, who was retiring, presented his colors to the new commander. Here, another star is added to his shoulder boards when he is formally promoted from Major General to a 3-star Lieutenant General. In the Far East, 1941 was the year of the snake. At Tokyo's Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito had cautioned the government of his new Prime Minister, General Tojo, against rushing into war. But at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, Ambassador Joseph Grew sent a coded dispatch to the State Department in Washington, revealing that the Japanese government planned, in the event of trouble with the United States, to attempt a surprise mass attack on Pearl Harbor. The project seemed fantastic. After going through channels at the State Department, the reaction was not one of alarm, but of astonishment. That a man of Ambassador Grew's caliber would take such nonsense seriously. Then it was turned over to the Navy Department, where it was rephrased. It was February when the warning was sent to the new naval commander in Hawaii, Admiral Kimmel, with this comment: "The Division of Naval Intelligence takes no credence in these rumors. No move against Pearl Harbor appears imminent or planned for the foreseeable future." After all, George Marshall, the Army's top general, was of the opinion that the Japanese wouldn't dare attack Pearl Harbor. His Navy counterpart, Admiral Stark, didn't believe such an attack was possible. These men had access to purple. The most difficult of Japanese diplomatic codes was called purple. A code so complicated that the Japanese believed it could never be broken. But it was broken by American cryptographers. Though the top leaders in Washington had access to Tokyo's secret communications, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, who were in the field, did not. The warning coming through in the Purple Code, detoured to Washington en route from Tokyo to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, is more than a tremor, it's a quake. It calls for a breakdown of Pearl Harbor into 5 areas, showing exact locations of warships. The decoded message goes through channels to the president, but isn't marked urgent or even important. Nor does Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy, regard it as urgent. Through a bureaucratic snafu, Admiral Kimmel never receives this critical information. Neither does General Short, whose job is to protect the ships when they're in port. To alleviate a worsening situation short of war, moderates in the Tokyo government send a special envoy to Washington, Saburo Kurusu, a skilled diplomat with an American wife. Kichisaburo Nomura was Japan's U.S. ambassador, a kindly 6-foot teddy bear of a man who loved both a good joke and good whiskey. The Japanese met with pious but crusty Cordell Hull for hours of peace talks. They saw eye to eye on nothing. Now General Short receives a war warning from General Marshall in Washington. Negotiations with Japan appear to be terminated. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. Take measures you deem necessary, but these measures should be carried out so as not to alarm civilian population or disclose intent. In General Short's thinking, if General Marshall had meant the danger of an all-out attack on Hawaii, that's what he would have said. The FBI picks up a vital piece of information through a phone tap. In Honolulu, the Japanese Consul General is burning his code books. Admiral Kimmel is informed, but the Navy neglects to pass this intelligence on to General Short. On Thursday, Congress adjourns for a long weekend. There are only 17 more shopping days to Christmas. peace negotiations are faltering. Japan needs oil. The U.S. will consider lifting the embargo on the condition that Japan halt its takeover of China and evacuate French Indochina. With little hope for peace, the terms are passed on to Tokyo. 13 parts of Tokyo's 14-part message to its Washington embassy have been intercepted and decoded. It's late Saturday evening when copies are distributed. The president reads his copy carefully and then hands it to his closest advisor, Harry Hopkins. "This means war," says the president. After reading it, Hopkins says, "It's too bad that we can't strike the first blow." The president answers, "We can't do that. We are a democracy and a peaceful people." No mention is made of Pearl Harbor. Like a ghost fleet, the Japanese carrier strike force moves silently through the thick fog. Fuses have been removed from radio equipment, transmission keys sealed. Strict radio silence is maintained. Ship-to-ship communications are carried out with signal flags during daylight and blinker lights at night. The fleet veers southward to Hawaii, increasing its speed to 20 knots. The Army has arranged for Hawaiian radio station KGMB to play music all night, so that a dozen B-17 bombers flying from San Francisco can home in on the signal. The planes are due to arrive Sunday morning. General Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, can't be reached for the moment. He's out on his Sunday morning ride when the codebreakers intercept the 14th and final part of Tokyo's message to its ambassador. The message ends ominously, stating, "It is impossible to reach an agreement through negotiations." But the 14th part does get to the President, the Secretary of State, and to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark. The codebreakers intercept another message from Tokyo. Urgent, very important. Its ambassadors are ordered to submit the 14-part message to Secretary Hull at precisely 1 p.m. your time. At sea, aircraft designated for the first wave are ready for takeoff. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuro Fuchida had come into the world 39 years ago, in the year of the tiger, meaning he was born a leader. Now he is leading the first wave of the most daring airstrike in modern history. Of the men under his command, he says, they do not fear death. Their only fear is that the attack might not be successful. In minutes, 183 planes are airborne. They follow radio station KGBM's pop music signal that is guiding B-17s in their flight from San Francisco. Reaching his office, General Marshall is jarred by Tokyo's urgent message. What is the significance of the 1 p.m. deadline? If it portends hostile action, where will the Japanese strike? Marshall writes out a warning. First priority, top secret, and orders it sent to the Philippines, the West Coast, Panama, and Hawaii. Atmospheric conditions are bad. Radio transmissions yield nothing but static. So the warning is sent via Western Union. The two Army privates running the Opana radar station are suddenly startled by blips on the screen. 50 planes headed for Oahu. Immediately, they report the sightings to the Army Operations Center. They're dismissed as U.S. planes coming from the mainland. Aircraft designated for the second wave of the attack take off. Now there is an air armada of 350 planes in flight to Pearl Harbor. For many people in Hawaii, military and civilian alike, it's a sleep-in Sunday morning. But church bells are already being rung for early morning services. And some servicemen who manage to get up on time attend an outdoor mass said by their chaplain. Messenger boy Tadeo Fuchikami picks up General Marshall's urgent cable for delivery to General Short. He takes his time. It hasn't been marked urgent or first priority. Commander Fuchida's first wave armada is on course. Below, in the clear, sunlit air, lay Battleship Row. In a clarion voice, Fuchida sings out the words, Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, tiger, tiger. Sleepy-eyed sailors and Marines, their breakfast getting cold, mistake the attack for some crazy kind of air raid drill. They think the planes are American. One of the men shouts, "This is the best damn drill the Air Force ever put on." When they catch sight of the rising suns on the wings, they begin feverishly defending themselves. But none of the anti-aircraft batteries has ammunition ready. The superbly coordinated attack goes off like clockwork. At 7:55 a.m., dive bombers hit Hickam and Wheeler airfields. Two minutes later, torpedo planes start their run on Battleship Row. 3 minutes later, Zero strafe other air bases. At 8:05, high-level bombers target the battleships. It is Fushida's first wave of aircraft that hits the Arizona, which erupts like a volcano. Flames burst 500 feet into the air. Fushida's deadly first wave sinks the West Virginia. Now the Oklahoma, a battle wagon moored outboard of the USS Maryland, shudders with torpedo hits. She begins listing and capsizes. The men below decks are trapped. More torpedoes rip into the battleships California and Nevada. Humiliated by their tardiness, Kuroso and Ambassador Nomura are an hour and 20 minutes late in presenting Tokyo's long decoded message, painstakingly typed to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Hull peruses the note as though he didn't know its contents. But he treats the two Japanese with icy contempt. At the same time, at Pearl Harbor, bombers are swarming on the USS Nevada, releasing torrents of destruction. On the other side of Ford Island, high-level bombers are dropping bombs from 10,000 feet. A stray Japanese bullet breaks through a window and grazes Admiral Kimmel's chest. He's unhurt, but the Admiral says, "It would have been merciful had it killed me." Now the second wave, made up of bombers and fighters, arrives to attack. But this time, anti-aircraft batteries are well-manned and fully loaded. Dive bombers rain down on the Pennsylvania, which is in dry dock. The Tennessee takes 2 hits. Second wave planes scream down over Wheeler Air Base to complete its destruction. But the vital element of surprise is lacking, and Americans are fighting back. After the last bomb is dropped, the United States of America virtually has a Pacific fleet no longer. 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 4 auxiliary ships are sunk or damaged. Some 350 planes are damaged or destroyed. In just 110 minutes, Japan kills more than 3,000 Americans. The Japanese lost 29 planes and fewer than 200 men. The Army and Navy spends the rest of Sunday putting out fires. It was a time of crisis. Most historians admit that the president, in the 16 hours before the attack, failed to confer with his military staff and set a course of action, but they don't subscribe to the conspiracy theory. Perhaps the cause is best understood in Admiral Kimmel's remark: they didn't think the Japs could pull it off.
In the spring of 1942, Japan's Imperial Navy felt invincible. They were fresh from a triumphant sneak attack against the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, and they had not lost a naval battle in 350 years. The attack cost the U.S. nearly all its battleships, but by a twist of fate, U.S. carriers had been out at sea and were spared. Carrier warfare would forever change the way sea battles were fought in the coming Battle of the Coral Sea. In 1942, in order to stay on top in the Pacific, the Japanese hatched a plan to keep the U.S. Navy at bay indefinitely. Japan's expanding empire ruled most of the western Pacific and its islands. Their next target was Port Moresby, a small but strategically located naval base in the Coral Sea on New Guinea's southern coast. Port Moresby was the gateway to Australia. If the Japanese could capture this vital port, America would never be able to use Australia as a base against Japan. The Japanese secretly began to close in on Moresby. But unknown to them, their code had been deciphered by American intelligence, a diligent piece of espionage which turned out to be the turning point of the Battle of the Coral Sea. The U.S. Navy's top brass immediately responded. 2 carrier task forces were assigned to the quick-thinking, quick-tempered Admiral Frank Fletcher. Shigeyoshi Inoue would be Fletcher's adversary. Inoue was in command of the Japanese Fifth Fleet with 2 brand-new carriers, the Shokaku and Zuikaku. He expected a clash with the U.S. Navy and had 140 carrier planes ready to counter an American assault. Inoue's guess was right on target. In early May, Fletcher's task force headed towards the Japanese Fifth Fleet at the Coral Sea. Because of the damage suffered at Pearl Harbor, Fletcher had only a few destroyers at his disposal. What he did have, though, were the carriers Lexington and Yorktown. Neither side knew what to expect in carrier-to-carrier combat. During the first day, the American and Japanese fleets were less than 100 miles apart in the Coral Sea. They fruitlessly sought each other out for the entire day, in the air and at sea, but they never found their targets. On the second day, everything changed. The Americans launched their planes that morning, hoping for better luck. Almost simultaneously, the Japanese launched their fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. The Japanese were the first to find their target. For 45 minutes, they relentlessly bombed 2 U.S. ships, sinking the destroyer USS Sims, one of the few America had, and killing most of the crew on the tanker USS Neosho. Other Japanese pilots were not so fortunate. Looking to rejoin their fleet, a lost squadron of Zeros spotted a carrier they thought was their own. It was not. It was the USS Yorktown. Only 6 of 27 Japanese planes would make it back to Inoue's carriers. The Americans had better luck. They had 93 planes ready to pound any enemy ship in sight. That ship was the Japanese carrier Shoho. In the Americans' first taste of battle, their pilot sent the Shoho to the bottom. Lieutenant Commander Bob Dixon radioed back to the Lexington, "Scratch one flat top." On day 3, the American planes sought out the rest of the Japanese carriers. Within minutes, they found the Shokaku and Zuikaku. 75 of Fletcher's planes swarmed in for the kill. They were met by only 13 Zeros, since most Japanese planes were out searching for American ships. The Japanese fleet was hit by wave after wave of American planes, with dive bombers scoring 3 direct hits on the Shokaku. While the American pilots were attacking the Japanese carriers, the Sea Eagles of Japan's Imperial Navy found a target of their own, the U.S. carriers Lexington and Yorktown. The Lexington threw up a wall of anti-aircraft fire. The Lexington tried evasive maneuvers, but Japan's Sea Eagles scored 3 direct hits in 2 minutes. Moments later, a bomb crashed through the deck of the Yorktown. The crew works furiously to extinguish the flames engulfing the huge carrier. But by the end of this day, 150 Americans have died on the Lexington and Yorktown. The Yorktown was saved to fight again. But that afternoon, the Lexington succumbed to an internal explosion. At 5 p.m., orders were given to abandon ship. 2,000 sailors went overboard, and not a single man drowned in the rescue. That evening, the great ship found its final resting place at the bottom of the Coral Sea. The Japanese, recognizing the severe damage their carriers received, call off their attack on Port Moresby and head home. The invincible Imperial Navy has suffered its first setback. The aircraft carrier was now king of the sea. For the first time in a battle at sea, warships had not fired a single salvo at each other. Port Moresby had been saved, and the U.S. Navy had gained valuable combat experience that would be tested a month later in the Battle of Midway. May of 1942, Midway Island, midway in the vast Pacific. American sailors stationed here considered it a quiet outpost. They had no idea that the Japanese, after their Coral Sea embarrassment, were devising a plan to crush this serene base and America's naval power forever. But this plan would backfire, and an overmatched U.S. Navy would change the balance of power in the Pacific in the Battle of Midway. Isoroku Yamamoto was the Imperial Navy's commander-in-chief. This Harvard-educated admiral had been the architect behind the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. He now wanted to crush the U.S. Navy before they got back on their feet. To do so, Yamamoto led a mighty fleet into battle comprised of 4 fleet carriers, 3 light carriers, 11 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 402 planes. The Americans could only scrape together 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 250 planes. The odds at Midway were overwhelmingly in favor of Japan. Yamamoto had designed an intricate scheme to destroy the United States Navy. First, he would launch an attack on America's Aleutian Islands. He expected this diversion would draw the U.S. Navy north, while his aircraft carriers launched a strike on Midway Island. Yamamoto's air attack would be followed by a troop landing of 5,000 soldiers. From Pearl Harbor, the remains of the U.S. Navy would rush to the rescue of Midway, only to be ambushed by Japan's main naval force lurking several hundred miles away. But as in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the diligence of U.S. Navy code breakers revealed the Japanese plan. On Midway, the U.S. forces prepared for the expected invasion. Pilots fresh out of flight school manned Avenger torpedo planes, B-17s, Wildcat fighters, and Catalina patrol bombers. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the American commander, knew the Japanese offensive would come between June 3rd and 5th. His plan was simple. If he could sneak his carriers within range of Midway, he could launch a surprise attack. Nimitz said this required exquisitely precise timing, a monumental dose of luck, or both. Nimitz secretly rushed the carriers Hornet and Enterprise back from the South Pacific. There was also the badly damaged USS Yorktown, which Yamamoto thought had been sunk in the Coral Sea. Its skipper told Nimitz the ship needed 90 days for repairs. Nimitz gave him 3. Admiral Frank Fletcher on the Yorktown was in overall control of the Midway fleet, while Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Spruance, who had never before commanded a carrier, was a replacement for Bull Halsey, who had been hospitalized from exhaustion. Against him would be Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. He led Japan's first striking force, comprised of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Behind the carriers was Admiral Yamamoto himself to make sure the battle went as planned. Yamamoto had predicted after Pearl Harbor that he would be able to control the Pacific for 6 months before American war production caught up with Japan's. Nearly 6 months had passed. Yamamoto hoped his attack on Midway would keep him a step ahead of his prophecy. The morning of June 4th, the Akagi turns into the wind to launch 108 planes on a mission to take out the U.S. defenses at Midway Island. U.S. radar picks them up 93 miles from their target. The Americans are ready. So are Navy cameramen who capture the battle in color. The Japanese, expecting to surprise the Americans as they did at Pearl Harbor, are surprised themselves when they meet strong resistance over Midway. In 25 minutes of battle, 38 of the 108 Japanese planes are shot down. Of the 26 American aircraft, Only 6 survived the attack. A seaplane hangar and a fuel dump explode. Midway's powerhouse and water plant are demolished. But the Americans' runways and anti-aircraft guns are left standing. The last Japanese Zeros to leave radio back to Nagumo that a second strike will be needed. Nagumo does not know whether or not to launch a second strike. He is certain the Japanese soldiers cannot invade the island unless the American defenses are annihilated. But arming his planes for a second airstrike will take precious time and leave Nagumo's carriers vulnerable to an American carrier attack. Nagumo takes the risk, believing that the American carriers are days away from Midway. He orders his planes to make ready, unaware that the U.S. carriers are only hours away. His decision to launch a second strike is the pivot point of the Battle of Midway. Admiral Spruance's U.S. task force has been closing in since dawn. Spruance knew Nagumo's carriers would be exposed as the Japanese planes returned from their attack on Midway. When Spruance came within 170 miles of Nagumo, his fighter plane's maximum range, he threw all of his cards on the table. The man who had never before commanded a carrier launched every plane he had. The American pilots quickly found Nagumo's fleet. But the more experienced Japanese pilots flying these highly maneuverable Zeros shot down most of the U.S. torpedo bombers before they ever reached a carrier. Not one of the Japanese ships took a serious hit. More than 100 U.S. planes were destroyed. A stunned American pilot said, "It was like the inside of a beehive." But as the low-flying American torpedo bombers were being shot down, the real U.S. threat was about to appear. A wave of American dive bombers flying high above found the Japanese fleet and began peeling off. The Japanese carriers, busy rearming planes for Nagumo's second strike, were helpless. Unloaded bombs and fuel lines carelessly littered their flight decks. Their protective screen of Zeros were too low to fight off this attack. In 6 minutes, the American dive bombers demolished 3 Japanese carriers. Those 6 minutes changed the balance of power for the rest of the Pacific War. The Akagi, Soryu, and the Kaga were all sunk. At noon, Japanese planes from their one surviving carrier found the Yorktown. This would be the Yorktown's final battle. 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes later, she was dead in the water. One observer said the great ship looked like a tired colossus, hurt beyond pain. This time there would be no repairs for the Yorktown. At 3 p.m., the crew was ordered to abandon ship. A Japanese sub eventually put the Yorktown to rest on the ocean floor. At 5 p.m., Spruance pulled together a squadron to return the favor. The last remaining Japanese flat top, the Hiryu, was sitting defenseless without support from the 3 sunken Japanese carriers. American pilots tripled the Hiryu. For 7 hours, the 1,100-member crew tried to salvage the Empress flagship, but to no avail. The Japanese national anthem warned the sailors to abandon ship. The admiral and captain stayed aboard, and after radioing an apology to Nagumo, went down with the ship. With Nagumo's carriers destroyed, Yamamoto ordered his fleet to withdraw. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, his prophecy had come to pass in the Battle of Midway. Yamamoto would never again be on the offensive in World War II. The reality of Midway rocked Japan's leadership, but news of the crushing defeat was hidden from the Japanese people. Prime Minister Tojo instead trumpeted the meaningless and unopposed landings in the Aleutian Islands as a great Japanese victory. American pilots returning from the battle knew better. Japan had lost 4 carriers while the Americans only lost 1. Japan's military edge was gone forever. One senior Japanese official said, "At Midway, the Americans avenged Pearl Harbor." In 1941, having overrun most of Western Europe, Adolf Hitler set his sights on conquering the Soviet Union. But Hitler's arrogance and foolish strategy would lock him into a battle he could not win. The Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a quaint city of parks nestled on the Volga River, which served as the gateway to Russian Asia. By war's end, it would barely resemble its former self. The city was of little strategic importance, but it lay in between 2 key areas Hitler coveted. To the north was Moscow, of which Hitler promised the German people, "The swastika will fly over the Kremlin." To the south were the Caucasus, with a bounty of precious oil to tempt the Führer. By capturing Stalingrad, Hitler could secure protection of the German army's northern flank when they invaded the Caucasus for badly needed fuel. In June of 1942, the German army advanced across a huge expanse of Mother Russia towards its target, Stalingrad. This footage of a cold-blooded killing shows how little regard the Nazis had for any Russian life they came across. The German offensive, named Code Blue, sliced ruthlessly through the countryside with little resistance. But where were the Russians? Hitler believed the Red Army was on its last legs. The reality was the Russians were learning to fight a modern war by not defending hopelessly exposed positions. Instead, they fell back to regroup as the puzzled German army closed in on stragglers. To Hitler, the conquest of Stalingrad looked like the fall of Poland, Norway, and France. He instructed his troops to show no mercy. Overconfident, the Führer abandoned his carefully worked-out plan to settle matters in Stalingrad before moving onto the Caucasus. Instead, he tried to take them simultaneously. General Halder tried to persuade Hitler that he could not sustain two powerful offensives in different directions, so Hitler dismissed him. At this moment, Hitler could have taken Stalingrad if his combined armies concentrated first on the city and then pursued the Caucasus. His blunder was to attempt to take them both simultaneously. Hitler's haste gave the Soviets precious time to regroup from the Don to the Volga. It was the pivot point of the Battle of Stalingrad. The Nazis had laid 22 pontoon bridges over the Don River as they rolled eastward, but still no Russian army. The Germans began a 40-mile march to the Volga. Their massive army of 330,000 men and 500 tanks was led by a man chosen through favoritism rather than ability. Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus had never commanded a regiment, let alone a division or corps. Nicknamed the Noble Lord, he wore white gloves and changed his uniform twice a day. But the stress of the next 6 months would transform the Noble Lord into a rabid dog. Hitler ordered Paulus to capture Stalingrad within 2 days. Young Nikita Khrushchev supervised the moves of Lieutenant General Yeremenko, the Russian commander in charge of Stalingrad. But the door-to-door fighting would soon come under the control of General Vasily Chikov. This ruthless peasant son with his gold-capped teeth and rumpled uniform told Yeremenko, "We shall hold the city or die there." Through every gutted building and every barricaded street corner, Stalingrad became a Soviet fortress. Often the front line was no more than a wall or floor separating different levels of a building. The Russians contested every foot of ground. German gains were measured in yards. Russian soldiers seeded the streets with mines and dug trenches to scurry from one building to another. They drew the Germans into a maze in which they were trapped in killing zones. The Germans had a name for this type of street fighting: Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. The city became a rat's nest of snipers, with each side bringing in their best marksmen. When Paulus committed his last reinforcements, the Germans controlled almost 90% of the city. Hitler confidently announced on German radio that Stalingrad had been captured. And almost at that very moment, the Russian winter began to bite. The temperature quickly dropped to 8 below zero. The Germans suffered their first cases of frostbite. And the Russian reinforcements began to stream in, men who knew how to deal with the Russian winter. Generals Vasilevsky and Zhukov now mapped out the Russian strategy for victory at Stalingrad. Their plan was to lure Hitler's army in towards the center of Stalingrad. Meanwhile, 1 million fresh Russian troops from outside the city would close the trap, ensnaring the German six in a double-pronged fist of steel. The Russian offensive begins with a cryptic communique from Moscow. Send a messenger to pick up the fur gloves. The Russians have waited patiently for the winter cold to ensure firm footing for their tanks. At Berchtesgaden, Hitler learns of the Russian counteroffensive. An aide urges him to permit the Sixth Army to break out from the trap. Hitler screams, "I won't leave the Volga." His reckless determination leads the German Sixth Army towards disaster. The Soviet forces complete the encirclement. Paulus radios Hitler that his army is completely surrounded. The Soviets are jubilant when they finally link up. They have ensnared the Germans, who can now be starved into submission. Hermann Göring, who has whiled away the winter in sunny Italy, tells Hitler, "My Führer, I announce that the Luftwaffe will supply the Sixth Army from the air." But to supply Paulus by air during the Russian winter is impossible. Hitler now looks to Leningrad for help from Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Hitler sends Manstein to rescue Paulus's entrapped Sixth Army. Manstein gets within 35 miles of Paulus, who at this point might save his men by blasting a path through to Manstein. But Paulus stands pat, fearful of defying Hitler's order not to retreat. The time has come for the Russians to eradicate the German Sixth Army. They send Paulus an ultimatum for an honorable surrender. He radios Hitler for permission. Of course, Hitler says no, and the Russians close in. The last German airstrip falls. Their planes can no longer land badly needed medicine for the sick and wounded. The last plane out to Berlin carried farewell letters from German soldiers to their families. The letters were confiscated in Berlin, and most were burned. Paulus radios Hitler one last time. Final collapse cannot be delayed more than 24 hours. The Führer replies with a macabre gesture. Hoping Paulus will commit suicide, Hitler promotes him to Field Marshal, knowing there is no record in military history of a German Field Marshal being taken prisoner. By 7:45 p.m., the Russians are at Field Marshal Paulus's door. He has chosen to live and tries to remain calm. His despair, however, is evident in the nervous tick in his eye. At Stalingrad, Joseph Stalin's military power has been dramatically reborn while the spirit of the German army has been broken. In 24 below zero weather, 91,000 German survivors, half-starved, frostbitten, wounded and dazed, hobble off to the frozen prisoner of war camps of Siberia. Only 5,000 will ever return. In spite of Hitler's propaganda, the image of the German soldier as invincible has been destroyed. The tide has turned. After Stalingrad, the Germans will be on the defensive for the rest of the war. In the summer of 1942, Major General Alexander Vandergrift and his U.S. Marines began a long journey from San Francisco Harbor. In America's first major offensive of World War II, these GIs were out to take a Japanese-held island of which they knew little or nothing at all. A storm masked the coming of the American Armada, foreshadowing the turbulent days that lay ahead at the Battle of Guadalcanal. "900 miles northeast of Australia, the Japanese were secretly building an airstrip on the island of Guadalcanal. If the strip were successfully completed, it would leave Australia open to Japanese air attacks and ultimately to invasion. The Allies needed to act. You're watching color motion pictures taken by the U.S. Marines as they landed on Guadalcanal. General Vandergrift paced around the command ship waiting for the opposition, but there was none. The Japanese had been taken by surprise. The first American casualty, in fact, was a soldier who cut his hand with a machete while opening a coconut. But this was just Act 1, in a battle that would rage for 6 months. The Marines bring their supplies ashore, an exhausting job slowed by outdated ships that need to be unloaded from over the sides. The task gave the Japanese precious time to prepare a counterattack. Fortunately, the Americans had an early warning system. Australian and native coast watchers on nearby islands alerted the Navy by radio as Japanese planes approached. But the Marines had little time to escape the enemy. For 2 days, Japanese bombers attacked. U.S. ships were forced to withdraw. The Marines were now on their own. During this fierce bombing, more than 100 Americans and Australians died off the coast of Guadalcanal. But the Marines pushed on through a mile of jungle to their objective, the nearly completed airstrip. There was little resistance. 1,700 Japanese engineers had fled from the airstrip as the Marines approached. The Americans named their rich prize Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a heroic Navy flyer who lost his life in the Battle of Midway 2 months before. The Japanese were far from finished. 7 of their cruisers moved quickly into the slot, a sea corridor through the Solomon Islands. By establishing naval superiority, the Japanese could land fresh troops to retake Henderson Field. It was clear to both sides that control of the seas around it meant control of the island. The battle for naval domination at Guadalcanal exploded at Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese began their attack at 1:43 a.m. By dawn, 5 Allied cruisers had been sunk. With Japanese sea superiority established, they soon landed 900 reinforcements. Their commander expected that would be enough. He was dead wrong. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki was so confident he began his attack with half his men still at sea. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers were mowed down by the U.S. Marines. 80% of Ichiki's men soon lay on the ground, the living, the dying, and the dead. The next morning, the Marines cleaned up the beach with their tanks. Afterwards, Vandergrift said, "The rear of the tanks looked like meat grinders." Colonel Ichiki found a quiet spot on the beach and committed harakiri. Despite the hard-earned victory, the Marines were still in desperate straits. Isolated, low on supplies, they knew they could not expect reinforcements as long as the Japanese Navy ruled the waters. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes, dysentery, torrents of rain, and creepy crawlers as big as your fist made matters even worse. And then there was the mud, and more mud. Worst of all, Guadalcanal was soon swarming with freshly landed Japanese troops. Who was this Japanese soldier? This was America's first offensive of World War II, and our troops had never before dealt with such an enemy, wrapped in camouflage, hiding in caves and trees. By September, the Japanese had regrouped to begin another assault on Henderson Field. With 6 times as many men as before, they came within 1,000 yards of Henderson before being turned back by the Marines. The Japanese began to wonder, who is this American fighting man? These were not the same poorly trained and equipped Americans the Japanese had overrun with ease in the early days of the war. But Japan would not give up on land or sea. Guadalcanal was critically important to them and to the Allies. When Admiral Chester Nimitz learned of the plan for the next all-out Japanese naval and ground attack, he appointed one of his toughest men to stop them. Admiral Bull Halsey, on learning of his new assignment, said, "Jesus Christ and General Jackson, this is the hottest potato they've ever handed me." Throughout November, the Japanese tried to isolate the Marines on Guadalcanal by crushing their naval support. One moment was dramatically captured on film. You're about to witness a direct hit on the Enterprise, which took the life of the man who shot this film. Then began one of the fiercest naval actions of World War II on the night of November 12th. 23 Japanese ships, including 2 battleships and a heavy cruiser, would never again see the light of day. Halsey's men had done their job well, forcing the Japanese Navy to withdraw from what they now called the Island of Death. It was the pivot point of Guadalcanal. With control of the sea, American troops and material quickly streamed in. Incredibly, the Japanese made one more attempt to land reserves on Guadalcanal. American pilots annihilated them like sitting ducks on the beach. 5,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in their landing craft in this hopeless last-ditch effort. In December, U.S. Army reinforcements arrived on Guadalcanal. Command was passed from Vandergrift's heroic Marines to the Army under General Patch. By February, the remaining Japanese troops could hold out no longer. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese had seemed unstoppable, but now America's long drive towards Tokyo and victory had begun. Had we not taken Guadalcanal, the Japanese could have extended their domination of the Pacific to Australia, and the U.S. might never have been able to push them back.
If you enjoyed the program that you just watched, contact your DVD provider about other Questar DVDs or visit www.questarentertainment.com.